John F. Kennedy walked into that diner expecting coffee. The owner handed him something nobody in American politics had ever received before. What that man said to a sitting president's face that morning would take 3 years, a tragedy, and a handwritten letter to finally make sense. It was February 1960 in Morgantown, West Virginia. A young senator was running for president in a state that did not believe he could win, and one diner owner was about to make a decision he would spend the rest of his life thinking about. If you believe some stories only make sense years later, subscribe so these untold moments find you. Morgantown, West Virginia, February 19, 1967 in the morning. The Appalachian winter had come in hard that week, and the windows of Ruth Ann's Diner on Chestnut Street were fogged from the inside. The kind of fog that builds up when a small room is full of working people drinking hot coffee before the sun has fully decided to show up. The booths were red vinyl, cracked at the seams and patched with electrical tape the color of a bruise. The counter had 8 stools, 6 of them occupied by men in work jackets who had been coming to this counter since before the Korean War. Men whose fathers had come before them, men who knew the price of a short stack and the name of every person who had ever worked the morning shift, and who regarded a stranger walking through that door the way people regard weather that was not in the forecast. The stranger who walked through the door at 7 that morning was 32 years old, lean, with a navy wool overcoat and a jawline that looked like it had been drawn by someone who took that kind of thing serious. He had a small campaign pin on his lapel. He had dark circles under his eyes from 3 straight days of handshaking and hall speaking across 6 counties. He had an aide named Patrick Doyle walking 2 steps behind him, who was 24 years old and had not slept in 36 hours, and who was carrying a briefcase and a thermos and the specific expression of a young man who has begun to suspect that enthusiasm alone will not get him through the next 4 months. The man behind the counter was named Earl Chatham. He was 58 years old, broad across the shoulders, with forearms built from 20 years of carrying sheet metal at the fabrication plant on Industrial Boulevard before. His left knee gave out, and he used his savings and his wife Margaret's patience to open this place in 1951. He had a gray crew cut and a white apron with a grease stain near the left hip that had survived every washing Margaret had put it through. He had a son named Robert who was 21 and working a second shift at the same plant Earl had left, and a daughter named Sylvia who was 17 and wanted to go to nursing school in Charleston, and whom Earl was going to find a way to send there even if it meant selling the pickup. He had voted in every election since 1942. He had strong opinions about most things and kept them behind the counter where they belonged most of the time. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at the navy overcoat. He looked at the campaign pin. He set down the coffee pot he was holding. Earl Chatham had read about John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the Morgantown Dominion Post the previous Thursday. He had read the piece twice. He had not read it a third time because the second time had told him everything he needed to know about how he felt, which was not warmly. Senator, Earl said. His voice was flat and even, the voice of a man who has decided what he is going to say before the other person has fully stepped through the door. I appreciate you coming into Morgantown, I do, but I am going to ask you to take your campaign somewhere else this morning. These men came in here to eat before work. They are not a photo opportunity. They are not a crowd. I would appreciate it if you respected that. Patrick Doyle took a step forward. Kennedy put one hand out without looking back, a gesture so practiced and quiet it stopped Patrick mid-stride the way a hand signal stops a well-trained dog. Kennedy looked at Earl. He did not look at the men on the stools, who had all gone very still in the way that people go still when they are trying to hear something without appearing to listen. He looked at Earl the way a man looks at another man when he is deciding whether to be offended or whether to be interested, and after a moment it was clear which one he had chosen. He said, "Can I have a cup of coffee and a seat at the end of the counter?" Earl looked at him for a long second. "Just you?" he said. "Not the cameras, not the handshaking. You sit, you drink your coffee, you leave these men alone." Kennedy turned to Patrick and said something quietly. Patrick went back out through the door. Kennedy took off his overcoat and folded it over his arm and walked to the last stool at the end of the counter and sat down. Earl poured him a cup of coffee without being asked again. Kennedy wrapped both hands around the mug the way a man wraps his hands around something warm when he has been cold for a long time, and he drank it without saying anything for almost 4 minutes. The man on the stool next to him was named Howard Briggs. Howard was 63 years old and had worked the coal face in 3 different mines across Monongalia County over the course of 40 years, and had the hands to prove it, and the lungs to prove it, and the hearing in his left ear to prove it. Howard was not a man who started conversations with strangers. He was a man who finished them. He said, without looking away from his coffee, "You really think you can carry West Virginia?" Kennedy said, "I think I have to try." Howard said, "Nobody up there cares about us. You know that, right? They never have." Kennedy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know that is what you have been given reason to believe. I am not going to tell you that I am different and expect you to take my word for it. I would not take my own word for it, either if I were sitting where you are sitting." Howard looked at him then, a full look, the kind Howard gave to things he was sizing up for weight and reliability. He did not say anything else. He went back to his coffee. But the look had been the kind that means something was registered and filed away in a place that does not get cleaned. Earl refilled Kennedy's cup without being asked. It was the kind of thing a man does when he has decided something about a person without wanting to announce it. Kennedy drank the second cup the same way he had drunk the first, both hands, unhurried. He left $2 on the counter when he stood up, which was $1.10 more than the coffee cost. He put on his overcoat. He nodded at Earl. Earl nodded back. He walked out through the door and back into the West Virginia morning and the campaign that had 3 more months and 11 more states to go before it became something the history books would argue about for the next 60 years. Kennedy carried West Virginia on May 10, 1960, by a margin that surprised the people who had said it could not be done, and confirmed what the people who had believed in it had been quietly certain of for months. He won the presidency in November. He was inaugurated on January 20, 1961, on a day so cold in Washington that the poet Robert Frost could not read his prepared poem because the sun off the snow was too bright for his eyes, and he recited from memory instead. Earl Chatham watched the inauguration on the black and white television set behind the counter of Ruth Ann's Diner on Chestnut Street in Morgantown. Margaret stood next to him with a dish towel over her shoulder. Neither of them said much. Howard Briggs came in for his regular coffee that morning and watched the last 10 minutes of it from the second stool and left without commenting, which was Howard's way of commenting. Sylvia started nursing school in Charleston that fall. Robert got a foreman position at the plant in the spring. Earl's left knee got worse and then better and then worse again. The diner kept going. The red vinyl booths got new tape. The counter got a crack near the 4th stool that Earl kept meaning to fix and never did, because it was not the kind of thing that stopped anybody from sitting down. On November 1963, Earl was behind the counter when the radio on the shelf above the coffee maker broke the news out of Dallas, Texas. He reached up and turned the volume all the way up. The diner went quiet the way places go quiet when something has happened that does not have a category yet. A woman in the 3rd booth put her hand over her mouth. Howard Briggs was not there that day. Earl stood behind the counter and listened to the radio and did not move for a long time. That evening, after he had closed up and Margaret had gone to bed, Earl sat at the kitchen table with a piece of lined paper and a ballpoint pen, and he wrote a letter. He wrote it the way a man writes something he has been carrying around for 3 years without knowing he was carrying it. He wrote about the morning in February of 1960. He wrote about the navy overcoat and the 2 hands around the coffee mug and the $2 left on the counter. He wrote about what Kennedy had said to Howard Briggs and what it had meant to a room full of men who had spent a long time being given reason to believe that nobody up there cared about them. He wrote that he had been wrong to make a judgment before a man had sat down. He wrote that he had watched a president get made on the counter of his diner and had not known it at the time, and now he was sitting in a kitchen in Morgantown, West Virginia, with a pen in his hand and a radio in the next room that was still talking about Dallas, and he wanted someone to know that the coffee had been hot and the man had drunk it like he meant it, and that had been enough. In the end, that had been exactly enough. He addressed the letter to the White House. He mailed it the following morning from the post office on Spruce Street. The letter Earl Chatham mailed on November 23, 1963 arrived at the White House mailroom on November 27th, 4 days after the assassination. 2 days after the funeral procession had moved through the streets of Washington and the whole country had watched John Kennedy's young son raise his hand at the rope line. The letter was processed by a staff member named Diane Ostrowski, who had been working White House correspondence for 11 years and who had spent the previous 4 days opening letters from every state in the country. Letters from people who had shaken his hand at a rally, letters from people who had seen him once through a car window, letters from people who had never seen him at all, but felt the specific grief of losing something they had only just begun to believe in. Diane read Earl's letter twice. She filed it in a folder marked Personal Correspondence, West Virginia 1960 Campaign. That folder was archived with the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, Massachusetts, where it remains to this day. Earl Chatham kept Ruth Ann's diner open until 1979, when his left knee finally made the decision for him. Sylvia became a registered nurse and worked for 31 years at a hospital in Charleston. Robert retired from the plant as a senior operations manager. Howard Briggs outlived 2 of his doctors and died in 1987 at the age of 90, having voted in every election between 1942 and 1986 without missing a single one. The diner building on Chestnut Street in Morgantown is a tax preparation office now. The counter is gone. The red vinyl booths are gone. But the crack near the 4th stool, the one Earl never got around to fixing, left a mark in the floor underneath that the new owners covered with a mat and never thought about again. If this story reached something inside you about the mornings that do not look like history while they are happening, take a moment to subscribe so these untold stories find you when they are ready. John Fitzgerald Kennedy sat at the end of a counter in West Virginia in a navy overcoat with cold hands and drank 2 cups of coffee and said the true thing to a man who needed to hear it, and that is the version of him that almost nobody has told. That is the version we tell here. Tap the thumbs up if this story stayed with you. Leave a comment and tell us about the moment a stranger said exactly what you needed to hear, the moment you almost turned someone away and did not. The morning that did not look like anything until years later when you understood what it had actually been. Ring the bell so the next story finds you when it is ready. We will be here.